former president of the United States once said, "Don't ask what your poop can do for you, ask what you can do for your poop." It may have been rephrased a little bit. But when was the last time you thought about what poop could do for you? If you think the answer is not much, I have news for you. Poop is literally a lifesaver for many animals, and humans are no exception. Let me tell you about how much we owe to camel poop. Back in the day, bacterial diseases were super deadly. Just ask anyone who's ever played the Oregon Trail. You have died of dysentery, again! But for nomadic people in northern Africa, dysentery wasn't an issue. They'd long known about an effective, if hard-to-swallow cure: a steaming ball of camel poop. This definitely sounds fake. This incredible cure was first noted by Western science in the late 1930s and early 1940s when soldiers stationed in Africa for World War II were dying of dysentery in droves, while the local nomadic people seemed mercifully free from the illness. Turned out they knew a secret: that eating camel dung could prevent or cure dysentery. And not camel dung that was dried and covered in chocolate or dissolved in herbal tea with a little lemon or something to, make it marginally more palatable. No, it had to be camel dung straight from the source. If it wasn't fresh and warm, it wouldn't work. And a bit of scientific digging soon revealed why this works. Bacteria. Specifically, camel dung contains Bacillus subtilis, a bacteria first identified on hay in 1835, though it's now considered a soil microbe. It's a cousin of the most notorious soil microbe, Bacillus anthracis, which causes anthrax. Luckily, this species is kinder and gentler to us. It's a straight-up monster to other microbes, though, which is a big part of why it's so great for treating dysentery. These bacteria secrete antibiotics that knock out species like Shigella, the bacteria often responsible for bacterial dysentery. In fact, genes for producing antibiotics take up about 5% of the B. subtilis genome. Furthermore, studies suggest having these bacteria in our gut can stimulate our immune system in ways that make us better at fending off stomach pathogens. And clinical trials have found that they're really helpful for treating diarrheal diseases. Now, given that B. subtilis was first spotted on grass and is considered a common soil microbe, you might be wondering why it had to be fresh camel poop. Can't I eat some dirt or grass? I don't want to eat camel poop. Well, no one has specifically looked at this, but the amount of B. subtilis in dung decreases over time, while things like fungi increase. Also, the drier the bacteria get, the less likely it is that they'll settle in and reproduce when they do end up in an animal's gut. So maybe it's simply a numbers thing. It has to be fresh poop to make sure you're getting a large enough dose. Fresh poop certainly has plenty of bacteria in it, especially camel poop, because camels host a lot of bacillus in their digestive systems. Some scientists even think these bacteria have adapted to thrive inside the guts of animals. And camels and other large herbivores gain a lot from letting them live there. That's because the bacteria produce enzymes that help the animals break down the tough plant matter that they eat. Of course, nowadays, severe bacterial dysentery is usually treated with a course of basic antibiotics rather than a spoonful of camel poop. Though B. subtilis is still used as a probiotic. The helpful bacteria are grown in labs and packed into capsules. No dung required. In fact, the species is so easy to grow, it's become an important model organism, so it's made all sorts of contributions to science. Researchers have used it to learn more about the fundamental processes of cells, like how they divide, as well as the limits of bacterial survival. So not only has it saved lives, it's helped us understand life in general. Alright, so eating poop, a little extreme. I'm glad we can take a pill now instead of chomping on camel excrement. But historically, there are other ways humans have relied on poopy products like fertilizer. For example, Michael has the scoop on bird poop.
When you hear the word conservation, it may seem like a concept and a movement that's only popped up in the last century or so. Like, as responsible human beings, we've realized what a terrible job prior generations have done managing ecosystems and the creatures that live there, and now we need some major conservation efforts to clean up the mess that we've made of our planet. But organized efforts to conserve resources that directly benefit humans are actually hundreds of years older than that. In fact, the first historical attempt at conservation, as we understand it now, is believed to have been made by the Inca way back in the 15th century to protect poop, specifically seabird poop. Let me explain. At its height, the Inca Empire was massive, spanning nearly 4,000 kilometers north and south. It stretched all the way down from what is now Ecuador into Chile, and extended from the Pacific Ocean to the Andes Mountains. Most of this area was extremely dry and lacked essential nutrients for plant growth, thanks to droughts and other climate factors. But the Inca Empire is well known for its agricultural achievements, like incredible terraced gardens, and was able to support a growing population of more than 8 million people on the food it grew. And the Inca can attribute at least some of the success to seabirds, specifically their poop. Following an example set by even earlier cultures, the Inca used seabird poop harvested from nearby offshore islands as a natural fertilizer for their crops. Not just any bird poop will work well as a fertilizer, though. Seabird poop, or guano, is packed full of nutrients essential for plant growth thanks to their seafood-rich diet. Most importantly, guano contains nitrogen and phosphorus, key ingredients in any fertilizer. But it is also balanced with many of the other chemicals that plants need, like potassium, calcium, iron, and several others. The uninhabited islands just off the coast of Peru had huge populations of seabirds living on them. Just 3 species contributed huge volumes of poop: the Peruvian pelican, the Peruvian booby, and the Guanay cormorant, which actually takes its name from the word guano. In fact, these Peruvian islands have been used as a natural source of fertilizer for thousands of years. Thanks to low rainfall, the guano and its nutrients wouldn't get washed away, and the poop used to accumulate into piles 50 meters high or more. The Inca recognized that it was vital to protect this important source of nutrients for their crops because it provided food stability for the empire. So they created laws that established protections for these offshore islands and the birds that called them home. A Peruvian chronicler by the name of De la Vega documented their efforts in 1609. He wrote that each offshore island was assigned to a certain Incan province, or if it was a large island, to 2 or 3 provinces. Each village in the province had its own piece of the island, and each homeowner in the village played a part in the conservation efforts, depending on how much poop they needed. There were also laws that helped protect the birds themselves. No one was allowed to set foot on the islands during the breeding season, so the birds wouldn't be scared off their nests. It was also illegal to kill them during any season, on or off the islands. The punishment for either offense was death. These accounts from De la Vega are believed by researchers to be evidence of some of the first intentional conservation efforts by humans. There are examples of earlier efforts to protect animals for spiritual and cultural reasons, which indirectly helped to protect those populations. However, this is the first example we know of where laws were set in place to protect a natural resource that was providing direct economic benefits to people. In this case, the Inca Empire. We use similar rationales in conservation today, like the establishment of national parks, though the death penalty is usually off the table. The Incas' efforts helped to keep the populations of these 3 bird species stable until the 19th century, when colonizers chose to ignore conservation in favor of overexploiting the islands. This led to the eventual decline of these seabirds, and while some have stabilized, others are still in trouble. Seabird poop is not quite as widely used today for crops thanks to synthetic fertilizers, but it is still a vital source of fertilizer for marine ecosystems. The nitrogen and phosphorus in seabird poop gives phytoplankton populations a boost and is important for corals. Healthy corals mean healthy reef fish, and commercial reef fishing is a $6 billion a year industry. In fact, the benefit provided by pooping seabirds has been estimated by conservationists to be worth at least $1 billion a year. Unfortunately, seabird populations around the globe are declining, thanks to a number of threats including ingesting marine debris or being caught as bycatch in fishing nets. But thanks to the Inca, we've known their value for hundreds of years, so hopefully we can take a leaf out of their book.
While we're talking about fecal conservation, it's worth mentioning an endangered species whose poop is huge for our ecosystems, and just huge also in general. Let us turn our attention to the sperm whale and its floating, nutrient-packed, watery poop. Commercial whaling was really bad for whales, especially sperm whales. People killed so many of them in the 19th and 20th centuries that even 10 years after hunting was stopped, there were less than 1/3 as many sperm whales as there were before. And their populations are still recovering today. But not only did whaling land sperm whales on the endangered species list, it may have caused some major problems for us too, by making climate change worse. And that's because all those whales were helping cool the planet by doing a lot of what every animal does best: pooping. While the blue whale is the largest whale in the ocean, sperm whales aren't exactly tiny. They grow to be up to 18 meters long and weigh around 35,000 kilograms. And no surprise here, they'd need to eat a lot to reach such massive proportions. Each whale consumes around 200 tons of food a year. Yes, I said each whale. Luckily, they are excellent divers, so they can feast on the buffet of creatures like squid and octopus that live thousands of meters down. These yummy critters are full of nutrients, including iron, something not always easy to come by in the ocean. They have tons of it because it gets bound up in the dark pigment in their ink. And I promise, that's not just a fun fact, it will become important in a moment. Now, while sperm whales eat most of their food in the dark depths, they do all of their other business at the surface. That's because when they're diving, their bodies shut down all non-essential functions to conserve oxygen, and that includes expelling waste. Also, it just so happens that their poop is super loose and runny, which is a lovely visual. Point is, because of its consistency, it floats around at the top of the water instead of sinking. And these floating watery feces are packed full of iron because the whales don't need all the stuff they get from those deep sea noms. About 90% of it gets pooped out. But you know what does need iron? Plants. It's an essential nutrient for photosynthesis. So all the tiny photosynthesizers that live in the ocean, collectively known as phytoplankton, love iron, and they don't care if it's from runny whale poop. In fact, in some spots in the ocean, these tiny plants literally can't get enough of this stuff. The dissolved iron in the water is so low that it keeps their populations from growing. That's because they require a specific form of iron called iron 2 that can easily dissolve in water. And most iron 2 makes its way into the ocean via dust. So places far from dusty lands, like the Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica, are extremely low in dissolved iron. But whales can help with that. Whales that live in low iron waters are like giant ocean crop dusters, fertilizing the water with their iron-rich poop. When a bunch of iron becomes available, the phytoplankton reproduce like it's going out of style. They can double their numbers in a single day, creating swirls of green visible from space. We call this a bloom. These blooms do a bunch of photosynthesizing, so they build tons of sugar out of carbon dioxide and water. That means they suck up lots of dissolved carbon dioxide that went into the water from the air. These blooms end up feeding all sorts of ocean creatures, from microscopic animals to filter-feeding whales. Eventually, though, all that yummy iron gets used up, and any phytoplankton that aren't eaten die. At this point, the carbon in their bodies could get broken down by microbes and returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But most of it sinks too quickly for that, so it ends up at the bottom of the ocean instead. And once it's down there, it stays down there. That carbon gets trapped for a really long time, like thousands of years or more. So the ultimate effect of whales pooping is less CO2 in our atmosphere. But it couldn't be that much, right? Well, in 2010, researchers actually crunched the numbers to figure out just how much carbon the 12,000 sperm whales living in the Southern Ocean were helping store. They found that while these whales breathe out around 160,000 tons of carbon per year, their poop fertilizes 400,000 tons of carbon storage. That's a net storage of 240,000 tons a year. Now, this is a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of tons of carbon dioxide humans pump into the air every year. So the Southern Ocean sperm whales aren't making much of a dent in our climate problem all by themselves. But they aren't the only whales in the Southern Ocean, and researchers believe that other species found there may be doing the same thing. Also, there used to be over 1 million sperm whales worldwide before commercial whaling. Just imagine the carbon storage potential if their populations rebounded to that level. And we're working on that. Sperm whales are currently protected in the US under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and also listed under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And conservation groups continue to push for legislation to protect the animals, as well as encourage companies to adopt whale-safe fishing gear and shipping practices and reduce ocean noise pollution. So the whales are already doing their part to combat climate change. Now, thanks to science, we know that by helping them bounce back, we can do ours. And that's not the only reason this kind of research is important. It also helps us understand how ocean ecosystems function as a whole, and how quickly that delicate balance can be disrupted. And that is just some plain old important science right there. Ah yes, the inextricable connection among carbon emissions, climate change, and big old dumps. I should have seen it coming. But if you're feeling a little bit hopeless about humanity's ability to reverse the effects of climate change, you might want to look to pandas for some inspiration. They use poop to keep warm when temperatures drop. Here's Stefan with the story.
If you give a pile of fresh horse poop to a panda, well, it'll probably just give you a funny look. Unless it's cold out, that is. If it's chilly enough, the panda might start to roll around in the poop and smear it all over itself. It's not because the poop is warm, but it does help pandas manage chilly temperatures in another way. Over the course of about 10 years, Chinese researchers studying the behavior of wild giant pandas noticed this weird poop-bathing behavior, and it seemed to be specific to horse poop. The scientists described the pandas as smearing horse manure over their entire bodies. Now, this raises an obvious question. Why? Well, the inevitable march of science being what it is, researchers decided to find out. And in 2020, they reported that they'd finally solved the mystery. Their observations showed a strong connection with temperature. Basically, pandas only do this when temperatures drop below 15 degrees. That provided one clue. The poop smearing habit had something to do with the cold. A second clue was that the poop generally had to be less than 10 days old for it to be appealing to the pandas. It did not have to be steaming hot, just relatively fresh. That gave the scientists the hint they needed to start looking at volatile compounds. These are chemicals that waft into the air and are often responsible for scents. In this case, the smell of horse poop. Their search eventually led them to two chemical compounds, beta-caryophyllene and caryophyllene oxide. These are members of a group of chemicals called terpenes, which are often found in plants. Beta-caryophyllene is what gives pepper its pepperiness, and caryophyllene oxide is found in plants like lemon balm and eucalyptus. Now, I know that's probably not what you imagine when you think of the smell of horse poop, but these compounds were wafting abundantly from the relatively fresh poop that the pandas preferred. Older manure had less of them. And when the researchers tried sprinkling these compounds on hay and giving it to zoo pandas, they rolled around in it, just like their wild cousins did with the poop. So what's the deal here? Well, it turns out that these chemicals mess with our body's cold sensors. In the study, the researchers demonstrated that mice given the compounds were less sensitive to the cold. Plus, they discovered that these compounds inhibit pandas' TRPM8 receptors, the major player in how our bodies sense cold. These proteins react to temperature and let your brain know that you're coming into contact with something cold. But there are ways of tricking these receptors. Menthol activates them, for example, which is why mints can make your mouth feel cool. And it turns out that the terpenes in fresh horse poop have the opposite effect, keeping pandas' TRPM8 receptors from working properly. So basically, by rolling in horse poop, the pandas are probably dulling the sting of the cold. It almost makes you wonder why other animals haven't discovered the wondrous warming powers of horse manure. Then again, maybe they're just sensible enough to look for other ways to stay warm.
And pandas aren't the only things covered in poop. Other animals, like bees, have chosen to cover their entire home with poop. No, not that much better, but it does keep bees from being decapitated by murder hornets, and here's why. Of the things that made headlines in 2020, murder hornets were probably not on your bingo card. I mean, giant hornets with the word murder right there in their name? Now, to be fair, the big thing that they're murdering is honeybees, not people, but since the planet and its flowers need honeybees, that's still bad news. So you may be relieved to hear that the murder hornets of your nightmares aren't totally unstoppable. All you need is a little poop. Generally, murder hornets are pretty awful to their busy little relatives. Like thumb-sized mercenaries, they enter honeybees' homes and begin decapitating them. Then the hornets take the bees' pupa to feed their own offspring. I mean, this is brutal, but one hornet can decapitate up to 40 bees a minute. So you kinda do have to admire their efficiency at least. So far, just one of these species has shown up in North America, but there are others that could potentially cause problems here, so it's a pretty big concern for us. See, North American bees are especially helpless during an attack because they lack the same kinds of defensive behaviors that protect other bees elsewhere in the world. Like this ingenious but gross strategy from one species of Asian honeybee. These bees fly out from their hive on a special mission. Their job is to collect animal feces, bring it home, and then smear it around the hive's entrance. Then, when the murder hornets show up and start chewing on the entrance to expand it, they get a nasty surprise. This behavior is called fecal spotting, and I love it. It's a great prank to play on a murder hornet that wants to kill you. But it's also a big deal from a biological perspective. For a start, this strategy represents the first time anyone has seen a honeybee search out solid, non-plant material. It's also significantly different from the way they transport pollen because they carry it away in their mandibles instead of on their hind legs. So we're learning something new about what bees are capable of. But also, this is the first time bees have been documented using tools. So this distinguishes them from most other insects. Now, it's near impossible to conclude that bees possess the same kind of abstract thought that is associated with tool use in humans because, I mean, how do you ask a bee about that? It does seem to imply a certain kind of intellect, though. The bees have somehow figured out that this works, and they also know what material to look for and how to bring it back to the hive. But really, probably the most important part of this discovery is what it can tell us about defending honeybees from invading murder hornets. Since not all bees do this, we might be able to use knowledge from the Asian bees to help out their cousins. Like if we can just identify the specific compounds in poop that repel the hornets, we could use that to post chemical do not enter signs on commercial honeybee hives, which could stop the invaders in their tracks. Pooping where you live is one thing, but pooping where you eat, that's next level gross. And it turns out that pitcher plants actually use their shape and color to entice animals to poop inside the pitcher, which is where they eat. So on the plus side, I guess we're not the only ones that eat poop. Stefan, tell us about these poopy plants.
Plants get most of their food from sunlight and air, but they also need nutrients like nitrogen to survive. And in parts of the world where the soil doesn't have a lot of nitrogen, some plants have evolved a pretty macabre way to meet their needs. They kill and eat animals. And it turns out that some carnivorous plants in Borneo go to even more extreme lengths to get their fix. They've gone back to playing nice, at least with some creatures, in exchange for a precious nitrogen-rich resource, animal feces. Nepenthes is a genus of pitcher plants, carnivorous plants that make pitcher-shaped traps. But in one species, the fanged pitcher plant, these traps are home to diving ants. Pitcher plants colonized by these ants have bigger leaves and a greater number of leaves, which makes them more efficient at photosynthesis. And in order to grow more leaves, plants need more nitrogen, since it's a key component of many cellular building blocks. In fact, researchers estimate that fanged pitcher plants occupied by diving ants contain 200% more nitrogen, so they really seem to benefit from these ants. At first glance, that seems weird, given that diving ants form their colonies inside the long hollow tendrils that the pitchers hang by, and they feed on the nectar that trickles out of the namesake teeth on the pitcher's rim. So their very presence costs the plant resources. Plus, they straight up steal the plant's prey. The plant's digestive juices aren't that great at breaking things down, and as their name suggests, these ants can dive into this weak digestive soup to fish out partially eaten bugs before the plant has a chance to finish them. But they do actually help the plant in several ways. Like, they hunt other insects that hang out in the traps and munch on what the plant has caught. Also, they hide under the pitcher's rim and ambush insects as they land, and since they're kind of messy eaters, they end up dropping bits that fall into the pitcher, which are way easier for the plant to digest. But most importantly, these ants poop directly into the pitcher juice, and by doing so, they give back some of the nutrients they borrow when they fish bugs out of the trap. And that's actually where most of that extra nitrogen comes from. Now, the fanged pitcher isn't the only Bornean pitcher plant that's figured out feces are full of nutrients. Some species partner with much larger poopers. For example, Lowe's pitcher plants. When they're young, they have typical pitcher traps, but as they mature, they start growing weirdly shaped ones instead. These new pitchers have a lid that secretes more nectar than any other Nepenthes species. And this nectar attracts the local mountain tree shrews, big-eyed rodents about 18 centimeters in length. The thing is, the only way the tree shrews can get the nectar is by positioning their rump right inside the pitcher. And it just so happens that this species of shrew marks places where good food can be found with poop. So as they're licking off the nectar, the pitcher plant gets lots of nitrogen and other nutrients. Scientists found that this close relationship between pitcher plants and shrews also occurs in two other species. All get up to 100% of their nitrogen from tree shrew poop, though each uses a slightly different setup to trap the shrew's butt in the right place. And even though more research is necessary, scientists hypothesize that the plants also evolved a mechanism to protect the structure of immature toilet pitchers from shrews until they're sturdy enough to support their butts. The fully mature shrew toilet takes on a dark purple hue that the tree shrew can actually see, so it's thought the color signals that the nectar toilet is open for business. And what's cool about all of this is that though these tree shrews are small by human standards, they're not extremely tiny. So the pitchers of these plant species are big, so big that they make them the biggest carnivorous plants known to science. Still, when it comes to pitcher reshaping, they've got nothing on their cousin, Nepenthes hemsleyiana. Its pitcher pitchers grow a peculiar lid, shaped sort of like a bat's ear. In fact, researchers discovered that, much like an actual bat's ear, this structure is a perfect reflector of the ultrasound cries that bats use for echolocation. And there's a good reason for that. You see, Hardwick's woolly bats roost in the pitchers. The pitcher wall shields them from the scorching sun during the day and keeps their skin free of parasites, since the noxious critters can't lay their eggs on the pitcher's waxy surface. The pitchers are also shaped in a way that prevents the bats from completely slipping inside, and the plant actually limits the amount of digestive juice in the pitcher so that it doesn't touch the bat's behinds. So they're quite the cozy place to roost. And Nepenthes hemsliana, in turn, receives the guano the bats release as they sleep. This mutualistic relationship explains that ear-like lid shape. In the Borneo swamp forest, it might be difficult to find the one species of pitcher plant that really wants you to snuggle in for a day of sleeping and pooping. But because of the highly reflective ear-shaped lids, bats can use their echolocation to navigate to these special pitchers no matter how much other greenery surrounds them. Whether we're talking about their partnerships with bats, ants, or tree shrews, Nepenthes pitcher plants remind us that there's no one way to have a nutritious diet. And one organism's waste can always be another one's treasure.
Now we've gone over animals and plants that eat poop and use it for all sorts of life-saving purposes, so for this last video we're not focusing so much on poop as on the pooping process and the animals that know it inside and out, enough to escape a predator's intestines. Here's Michael to get to the bottom of it.
Animals have a lot of different strategies for getting themselves out of tight spots, but most of them involve evading capture, because there's just not a whole lot you can do if you've already been eaten. Unless you're this particular type of water beetle. Regimbardia attenuata is a water scavenger beetle found all across the eastern half of the globe, from Australia to Japan to the Arabian Peninsula. It's small, dome-shaped. Kinda cute. But it didn't get a whole lot of attention until biologist Shinji Sugiura fed one to a pond frog and then watched it crawl out the other end. And it wasn't a fluke either. He's since discovered that 9 times out of 10, this particular brand of beetle makes its way out of a pond frog's digestive system alive. And at least 2/3 of the time, these beetles escape the digestive tracts of 4 other frog species, although the success rate seems to vary a bit depending on the frog. Now, the first thing you've got to wonder is if these beetles are actively trying to escape, or if they're just waiting around until they get pooped out. Sugiura wondered that too, so he devised an experiment. He used wax to glue together the legs of some unfortunate beetles so they couldn't move, then fed them to the frogs. Spoiler alert, the beetles died. Also, it took a long time for them to reappear, like more than 24 hours, while unglued beetles generally made their escape in less than 6. One was even observed exiting after about 6 minutes. Maybe it wasn't his first time? Anyway, this seems to confirm that the beetles are actively escaping. But while their survival seems kind of miraculous, it's probably evolutionary luck. Regimbardia attenuata is an accomplished swimmer, so once inside a frog, it just keeps doing what it does best. It also has its own personal scuba tank. It stores a bit of air under its exoskeleton, so the oxygen-free environment isn't a problem either. And water beetles are kind of naturally watertight, so that hard armored shell probably gives it some protection against the frog's digestive juices. But then there's that final, seemingly insurmountable barrier, the frog's sphincter. The beetles aren't strong enough to force the opening, still they seem to know what to do. You see, the beetles always come out head first, so researchers think that they're mechanically stimulating the hindgut to induce the frog to poop. You know, just like this talent for surviving digestion isn't totally unique in the animal kingdom. Some snails can make the trip through a bird's gut, and some fish eggs may occasionally survive too. But they're not quite as good at it. According to experimental studies, only about 15% of snails make it through alive, and less than 1% of fish eggs do. Plus, they don't play an active role in their eventual escape. Interestingly though, when scientists tried other beetles from the same family, they all got digested. Still, it's likely Regimbardia attenuata isn't the only water beetle that survives digestion. Most humans don't spend their downtime looking at frog butts, so we may be missing the evidence for this weirdly effective survival strategy in other species. Or maybe the other water beetles are just like, nope, digest me already. I draw the line at sphincters.
Being around poop doesn't necessarily stink. Sometimes it means survival. And here on SciShow, we keep you up to date on a lot of what's going down with poop. Some people say we maybe keep you a little bit too up to date, but it's not as bad as our pee videos. We make so many pee videos. Have I mentioned that we have a channel called SciShow P that has almost 30,000 subscribers? Check it out if you're interested. We recently posted a recording of our podcast, SciShow Tangents, there. Will we get a silver play button if a bunch of people just go click on subscribe? I swear we won't post that many videos to it. I just want a silver play button for our P channel.